This is Vander Decken, one of the more controversial One Piece antagonists who is almost universally despised to a point where many readers and watchers would prefer if he never existed at all. But are we being too harsh on old Mr. Vander Decken and not really appreciating what it is he brought to the table? I mean, maybe what he brought was a plate of feces, but perhaps it was a gourmet dish for a very acquired taste. Whatever it is, we're gonna figure it out. Because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the series in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video. This time featuring the man who may or may not literally be a mushroom, Vander Decken. That's a genuine theory because Vander Decken is a fisherman whose family actually came from the surface. And he has the same amount of legs as a race known as the Kinokobito, mushroom people, one of which we saw trapped in Big Mom's library, and no other fishman has this four-legged characteristic. So the idea here is that Vander Decken's ancestor was a mushroom man that dove deep into the sea and then did some things with some fish. And then 8 generations later, here we are with Vander Decken the Ninth. But Vander Decken's introduction is deliberately similar to Brook's during Thriller Bark. We see this terrifyingly cool ghost ship with an unknown figure singing, and my favorite part of this is that the most scared character is Brook, despite the fact that this is exactly what he used to do. But then Brook goes on to give us some valuable insight. That ship doesn't belong in this world. It's hundreds of years old. On a stormy night, a pirate captain suddenly went mad and threw his crew overboard. He drowned them all and cursed to the gods. His name was Captain Vander Decken, and his ship was the Flying Dutchman. To punish him, the gods decreed that he should roam the seas for all eternity. And in retrospect, this discussion about gods is fascinating. When Fishman Island was being published weekly, we didn't really take this talk about gods seriously. It was all just exaggerated or even completely made up legends to us. However, with the focus on gods that modern One Piece has, I'm actually very interested in Vander Decken's potential encounter with what appears to be some sort of sea god. However, in addition to the ship and the legend, we also see a glimpse of Vander Decken himself, a cloaked figure with a classic Oda silhouetted smile, and it's pretty unsettling but also a very effective setup. You've got this underwater ghost ship containing a figure who is said to be hundreds of years old. It holds a lot of promise about discovering something deep and dark about the One Piece world. Something that existed in the days of Nolan, the days of Oars, and perhaps even during the Void Century, and something that is threatening enough to have survived this long. And that is our first key issue with Vander Decken, which is that promise is immediately broken. To say that Vander Decken does not live up to the legend is putting it very nicely, as when we do see Vander Decken's full design, it's not even the man who we've been talking about. Our antagonist is in fact Vander Decken the Ninth, a descendant of the legendary original Vander Decken, which I remember being quite disappointed by even before we got to know him, because what we have here is a case of legend nepotism. Vander Decken has inherited his status from his ancestor, but as we'll see, he very much does not deserve it. And this isn't all that strange for One Piece. Oda does this sort of thing all the time. He portrays a fearsome idea and then reveals it to be a comical sham. And this format very much fits Vander Decken, and it does result in a lot of comedy, such as when he throws an axe claiming that he never misses his mark, but it comes back and chops off the mast of his own ship. That is very funny. I like it a lot. But I think the whole idea of Vander Decken is something that gets punished by a case of poor timing. As one of the first primary antagonists of the post-time skip era, Vander Decken doesn't meet the expectation of a villain who can command a compelling challenge for the newly reunited Straw Hats, because we trained for 2 whole years with the mission to become strong enough to enter the new world, and our first obstacle is a very pre-time skip level of antagonist. I could definitely see Vander Decken working very well in an earlier arc, a much earlier arc. Like maybe if Vander Decken was a member of Baroque Works, or if he was another weirdo working for Gecko Moria, or even part of the Arlong Pirates, which could have happened. Apparently Arlong wanted and courted Vander Decken to become part of his crew, so there is a crazy alternate reality out there where Vander Decken could have been fought during East Blue, but he very much has that vibe about him. Not a particularly strong villain with a crazy character quirk and a mildly troublesome but creative devil fruit. That is a lot of pre-time skip One Piece villains, which is unfortunate because at no point does Vander Decken feel like a problem that we need the post-time skip Straw Hats to solve. To give him some credit, Vander Decken does have a brutally villainous moment when he stabs Hart-chan, which is infuriating because we love Hart-chan at this stage. Luffy punched St. Charles at the human auction house just because Hart-chan got shot, and the way that Vander Decken stabbed him was so disrespectful, by using his devil fruits to stab Hart-chan in the back like a coward. But this does set him up as quite a smart villain. Definitely lacking in power, but strongly capable in in the field of deception. This is what this scene sets Vander Decken up as. But Fisherman Island doesn't really ever make good on that. The Vander Decken we go on to see isn't particularly smart or effective. At no point beyond this is Vander Decken anything to be afraid of beyond needing to monitor the bushes outside of your windows. Although one thing I do love about him that doesn't get explored too much in One Piece is that Vander Decken is a fisherman devil fruit user. So there's a lot of really interesting logistical issues surrounding his existence living underwater, and eating devil fruits are often referred to as cursing the user by taking away their ability to swim, and in no character is that curse more present than Vander Decken. So he does carry on the legacy of his cursed ancestor in some way, and there are other fishermen with devil fruits like Jack and Sasaki, but neither of them get to explore this curse to the same degree that Vander Decken does. But with that, we should talk about what is, I think, 95% of Vander Decken's character, which would be his infatuation with Princess Shirahoshi. I want to start by saying that characters obsessed with love are insufferable at the best of times in shonen manga, and with One Piece, due to the nature of it being a battle manga, as well as Eiichiro Oda's personal writing rules, love isn't something that's ever going to be explored beyond a surface level gimmick. So that's not a good sign for Vander Decken, because if that's all there is to him, then we know that we're not going to really dive deeply into any of that. And so what you see in his first scene is exactly what you get in every scene. Vander Decken's always yelling a variant of, "Swear your love to me or die. Your life can only consist of marriage or death." He says that a lot, many iterations of, "If I can't have you, then I'll kill you." And he says it a lot because there's just not much else for him to say. Again, One Piece isn't the kind of manga that's designed to explore anything insightful with this kind of toxic obsession, which might be a shame because Vander Decken's fruit, the Mata Mata no Mi, is very much the ultimate nightmare stalkerish fruit, always allowing him to find Shirahoshi no matter where on the planet she goes. It's quite terrifying. And the mechanics of his devil fruit do also result in some creepiness. Let me explain. Vander Decken records his targets by touching them with his palm, but if he was to then touch a different person with that same palm, then it overwrites and records a new target. Meaning that in pursuit of his obsession with Shirahoshi, Vander Decken hasn't washed his hand since he first touched her 10 years ago, which just adds to that uncomfortable creepiness because you just know that this hand is going to be the most putrid thing that you've ever had the misfortune of being around. I will give Vander Decken some credit though, because I do think that his true motivations with Shirahoshi are often forgotten beneath all of the obnoxious marriage proposals. But Vander Decken had no interest in Shirahoshi until she used the powers of Poseidon for the first time, which is very relevant as the original Vander Decken's life goal was to find Poseidon, and that's why this maybe Mushroom Man sailed all the way down to the seafloor. So the larger goal here is something actually vaguely understandable, which is Vander Decken the Ninth wanting to fulfill his ancestors' wishes and legacy, which is very One Piece and we have seen done before in more palatable cases, like Mont Blanc Cricket wanting to discover the truth of his ancestor Noland. It's just the way that Vander Decken goes about fulfilling this legacy that becomes highly creepy and questionable. But an argument can be made that he's in love with the idea of Poseidon much more so than Shirahoshi. I don't know if that argument holds up very well, we'll see. But that's why he wants to lock Poseidon down ASAP via marriage, and also why Vander Decken says stuff like, if he can't have Shirahoshi, then no one else can. Because he's not just talking about an obsession with a mermaid, he's talking about someone else potentially gaining the ability to use Poseidon. And I should say that the idea for the Shirahoshi infatuation potentially has its origins in Wagner's The Flying Dutchman opera, which features a sea captain cursed to roam the world forever until he can find a faithful wife to break that curse. Which in a roundabout way is what's happening here. Vander Decken is trying to break the curse of his family line by obtaining and marrying Poseidon. Thus, I guess, finding a faithful wife, but in his case, the faithful wife part is irrelevant. It's just what he wants. And I also can't be too generous with him because he does very early on develop an actual obsession with Shirahoshi herself. And his plan is to get his hands on the Tamate box, which is said to have the power to make anyone age, which we know is true through the energy steroids. It's a side effect. But Vander Decken wanted to age Shirahoshi up to turn her into a, quote, sexy young woman. So at the very least, he's not attracted to children. That's probably Vander Decken's biggest redeeming quality, which is more of a baseline expectation for everyone else. But it doesn't help that every time Vander Decken describes his infatuation, he needs to linger on a physical element of Shirahoshi. Like when he says, "That's my Shirahoshi," beautiful in both body and mind. He can never compliment her without saying something like, "Damn, you got some sweet mega mermaid milkers on ya." And even with the legacy of his ancestor in mind, Vander Decken doesn't have particularly well-constructed plans of what he'd do even if he did get access to Poseidon. As far as as we know from his own mental image, he'd only use it to become extremely wealthy. All we get of his dreams of the future is this mental pile of treasure. So despite this potentially very interesting exploration of inherited will, it's all in the service of a whole lot of nothing. And look, there is some poetic wankery that you could assign to it. The fact that Vander Decken's ancestor dove so deep and it's all in service of something so shallow in the modern day. And there's also the idea of the original Vander Decken's dream being to seek the cold, dark depths of the sea, whilst the dream of the original mermaid princess was to rise up and live under the warm, bright sun of the surface. And then you've also got the dichotomy of Hody Jones fighting for his pursuit of twisted hate, joining forces with Vander Decken the Ninth pursuing his twisted love. A very nice little toxic yin-yang. So there are definite ideas happening here, and I think they're intentional. But Vander Decken just isn't a great vehicle to explore and expand them. Although one more positive thing I will say about this is that the whole Shirahoshi situation does lead to one pretty great moment of comedy, which is when Vander Decken asks Shirahoshi to marry him and she replies that Vander Decken just isn't her type, which I think is a hilariously mundane reply given the circumstances, and Vander Decken's face afterwards always cracks me up, as does the fact that he shaved his head out of grief afterwards in a very Britney Spears-esque meltdown. But what this comes down to is that Shirahoshi is Vander Decken's main emotional plot. However, despite the fact that Vander Decken is responsible for her current situation of being locked up and protected and everything, Shirahoshi's main emotional beats are all about Hody Jones, and the fact that she made a promise to not hate her mother's murderer, because Otohime wanted to stop the cycle of hatred and prevent her children from being consumed by it, lest they end up like Hody Jones themselves. That's where Shirahoshi's entire emotional weight is geared towards. It's all about Hody Jones, and Vander Decken is very much this awkward third wheel in this dynamic. Although another minor plus for Vander Decken is seeing a pirate alliance form between he and Hody Jones. That was very cool. As I've said about Vander Decken in this video, as well as Hody in his own examination, neither of these guys really carried the expectation of a post-time skip One Piece antagonist, so it was definitely a good idea to have them join forces, because that at least gives us something to work with. Individually, they're both kind of nothing. Together, maybe they're a thing. And it also gives us something to break down at the end of the arc, because this alliance does not end well. But to linger on Hody, he unfortunately makes Vander Decken look a lot less compelling by juxtaposition, as Hody's goal is quite esoteric, and it boils down to the concept of spreading and sustaining hatred for reasons that he himself doesn't quite understand. But enthralled by the feeling, he concocts a plan to overthrow the Ryugu monarchy for the purpose of eventually spreading hatred throughout the entire world. So you've got that as one villain's goal. Meanwhile, what Vander Decken wants to do is marry a child and age her up to a more effable state. So there's a pretty big disconnect of ambition here. And one antagonist is always more compelling than the other, and unfortunately that antagonist is not Vander Decken. Furthermore, I should say that Hody isn't traditionally remembered as one of the narratively stronger villains in the series either, so to be overshadowed by him is an incredibly bad sign. And Vander Decken's involvement in the rest of the arc can be summed up as follows. Shirahoshi politely rejects him, and he throws a tantrum and then throws an arc. Vander Decken is so full of hurt feelings from this rejection that he resolves to, quote, smash everything. And throwing the Noah at Shirahoshi is a very cool idea, and it almost makes the entire character worth it, almost. Because what I like about this is that it does give Shirahoshi the opportunity to be actively involved in the arc and make a huge decision to potentially sacrifice herself to save the people of Fishman Island. Great moment for Shirahoshi. Beautiful. I love it when she gets herself in front of the ship. But as for Vander Decken, he gets a bit of an unconventional arc climax, if you can call it that as a villain. It's more of an arc anti-climax. It's not good. Which is that he gets betrayed by the other arc antagonist, although to be fair, Vander Decken kind of screwed Hody over first. But the idea is that Hody wants to kill Vander Decken so that his devil fruit abilities wear off. Meaning that at this stage, the Noah, which is kind of up here, would just fall and destroy Fishman Island no matter what Shirahoshi did. And that is a very dramatically sound idea. However, the Vander Decken character is so incompetent at its core that he can't even die properly to service this idea. Because what happens is he survives Hody's attack, and then Vander Decken slips, falls over, hits his head, knocking himself unconscious, which releases his abilities, and the Noah does start to fall. And look, if he had died right then and there when Hody attacked him, I think that would have gone a long way towards redeeming the character. Not in terms of making us like him or respect him or even appreciate him, but having a dramatic moment like that to at least build up to something that made it maybe worth our time to follow him. But Vander doesn't get any kind of satisfying defeat. There's no punishment for his assorted crimes. There's no fight. There's no emotional conflict. He doesn't even get knocked out by Luffy and other Straw Hat, Shirahoshi, or even Hody. He's just a bit of a goof and slips over and removes himself from the climax of the arc that he is one of the dual main antagonists of, and isn't seen again until everything's all over as they tie Vander and Hody Jones up Scooby-Doo style, and we're done here. Back to the mystery machine for another adventure. And that's the very last we see of Vander in the manga, and almost the last we see of him in One Piece media in general. His only other appearance to date was a cameo in One Piece Stampede, where you briefly see him at the Pirates Festival hidden among a crowd. But when I was sitting down to write this video, I had a realization. And that realization was, I completely forgot what happened to Vander at the end of Fishman Island, which is slightly embarrassing because remembering what happened to fictional pirates is like my only job. But I hadn't forgotten what happened to him. It's just that what happened to Vander was nothing, which is why I couldn't remember anything. And it's unfortunate because usually even the most hated One Piece villains get some kind of story beyond their arcs, something that adds an extra layer to them and makes them feel a bit more like living, breathing beings. But Vander is very two-dimensional from start to finish, which is a shame because there are a lot of good ideas there that Vander doesn't live up to. The character has a very solid foundation in the One Piece world, as well as through inspiration from real-world myths, so there's a lot that could have potentially been done with his ancestors' connection to Poseidon and inheriting that will, but all of these ideas just sort of get jizzed into a tissue in the shape of the Vander that we do get. And I think he's a character who may slightly appreciate in the future, simply due to his lineage and connection with Poseidon. There's probably a very interesting story to tell about his ancestor who likely lived during the Void Century, but we're getting a bit desperate here because that is talking about a completely different character. As for Vander the Ninth, I honestly think he's an E-tier villain. I can see the seeds of potential, and there are some cool and funny things that were done, but he did not rise to the occasion. He didn't have a satisfying conclusion. He's done nothing ever since, and arguably didn't do much of anything along the way, and that's kind of that. So you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next.